Number the unexpected prison. Camp McCoy, 1944. They had been warned that Americans would brutalize them, deprive them of food, and rob them of their humanity. But when Japanese captives arrived at Camp McCoy in 1944, what defeated them wasn't violence, it was burgers and Coca-Cola. They anticipated death, not continued existence. When the railcar doors scraped open in the harsh Wisconsin winter of 1944, several dozen Japanese servicemen descended onto the snow-covered terrain, squinting against the dim sunlight. Their military dress was ragged, held together with thread or fabric strips. Starvation was evident in their appearance, gaunt faces, exhausted eyes, chapped lips from weeks of inadequate provisions and transport. Every man had absorbed the identical doctrine from his earliest days in the imperial military. Being taken prisoner meant disgrace. Capture represented something more terrible than dying. They'd been cautioned that the Americans would abuse them, withhold food, and degrade them until they pleaded for compassion. Most had steeled themselves to be killed the instant they exited the train. Yet what greeted them gave them pause. Lines of timber structures stood in the snow. Watchtowers, fencing topped with barbed wire, a handful of armed sentries. But the environment wasn't what they'd envisioned. There existed organization here, even a sense of calm regularity. Vehicles moved along the camp pathways, and smoke rising from cooking stacks carried the aroma of prepared meals, substantial food, far more potent than the thin broths they'd survived on for months. Several captives traded anxious looks. Others maintained downcast eyes, unwilling to reveal even a hint of interest. The sentries barked instructions in English, sharp and rapid. The captives couldn't comprehend most of it, but the manner was authoritative, not barbaric. Translators clarified, "Form lines, proceed forward, maintain your ranks." Red Cross personnel watched from the periphery, holding clipboards. That sight alone startled the captives. At home, they'd been informed America was chaotic, savage, unconcerned with international agreements. Yet here stood neutral observers making certain protocols were upheld. Could this be genuine? The processing was systematic yet surprisingly humane. Men underwent delousing, their vermin-riddled garments incinerated. Medical examinations checked for fever, undernourishment, fractured bones. A Japanese serviceman with a wrapped forearm anticipated being disregarded. Instead, an American medical officer examined the injury, sanitized it, and applied fresh bandaging. The serviceman sat motionless, unable to reconcile this compassionate action with the image of the savage adversary that had been drilled into him. One captive murmured to another in astonishment, "Why would they perform this? We aren't their people. We are worthless." Another shook his head. "It must be deception. Just wait." The dread persisted. Each action felt like it might trigger the retribution they'd been told was inevitable. Yet every passing hour unveiled something more peculiar, an unanticipated adherence to the Geneva Convention. That term they'd heard whispered previously but never trusted would hold significance. Following registration, the men marched across the compound to their new lodgings. Snow compressed beneath their footwear. The cold penetrated their inadequate jackets, but the structures, though basic, were warmed with heating units, equipped with sleeping platforms, and supplied with woolen covers. It wasn't home, not liberty, but it was refuge. A few captives settled heavily onto the sleeping surfaces, testing them with their hands as if concerned the comfort might disappear. Barbed wire remained visible through the windows, a constant reminder this was imprisonment. Yet inside, the men registered something they couldn't disregard. The facility operated like machinery, yes, but not like a torture chamber. The disparity troubled them. Their entire lives they'd been taught that capture meant humiliation, that yielding stripped them of dignity, reducing them to beasts in their adversary's view. But here at Camp McCoy, the initial impressions formed differently. A sentry assisting an ailing man to steady himself, a medical worker carefully applying gauze, a Red Cross delegate verifying that provisions were allocated justly. The men didn't ease up. Not yet. Mistrust lived in their chests like an extra heartbeat, but as darkness arrived, and they rested on beds beneath actual blankets, they couldn't help wondering if the greatest surprise wasn't imprisonment itself, but how imprisonment resembled nothing like the horror they'd prepared for. For servicemen who'd anticipated brutality, the opening day at Camp McCoy marked the start of something they lacked words to describe. But the genuine shock wouldn't arrive with regulations or sleeping quarters. It would arrive on a serving dish in the dining facility, accompanied by the scent of cooked meat and the fizz of carbonated beverages waiting to be consumed. The following morning, the captives awakened not to violence or screamed abuse, but to a trumpet signal. The noise jolted many of them not from its volume but from its familiarity. They'd heard the identical sound in their own installations back in Japan. Momentarily, some lost track of their location, but then reality returned with the clatter of boots and the English conversations outside. They were commanded into rows, counted, and guided toward the dining facility. The fear of what awaited them weighed heavily in their chests. Many anticipated that nourishment would be denied, or that they'd receive refuse unfit for creatures. Starvation had been their steady companion in the Pacific. Rations had diminished to portions of watery rice, occasionally barley, and if fortunate, some preserved vegetables. Meat was scarce, sugar practically legendary, but prior to eating came formalities. The captives assembled in a sizable chamber, where a Red Cross delegate spoke to them through a translator. He outlined their protections under the Geneva Convention. They would receive food, shelter, and permission to send correspondence. They would perform labor, but only under specific parameters. They would not suffer abuse. They would receive regular visits from impartial representatives to confirm these standards were maintained. The statements were received with skepticism. Some men averted their eyes, mortified that they were hearing this. Others muttered among themselves, unconvinced. One serviceman whispered to his companion, "They mention protections, but we are their captives." Why would they concern themselves? The translator paused to let whispers fade. "These aren't mere assurances," he stated. "These are regulations. For you, for them. They are obligatory." The significance of those statements lingered in the atmosphere. Afterward came health examinations, more comprehensive than the previous day. A physician pressed fingers against thin wrists, inspected teeth, took blood pressure readings. Captives were measured on scales, and many registered underweight. Some Americans responded with quiet headshakes at the figures. Malnutrition was apparent, yet nobody ridiculed them. A corporal even distributed vitamins, small powdery tablets that confused the men. Medicine for adversaries? It was almost offensive in its generosity. By afternoon, they received fresh garments. Plain, functional uniforms stamped with PW in prominent lettering. The clothing fit better than their torn battlefield remnants. Some captives slipped into them gradually, hesitating as though each seam was a relinquishment of self. Others welcomed the warmth, shivering less as the Wisconsin winds pushed through the structure gaps. The sentries themselves were another revelation. Yes, they carried weapons, maintained discipline, and stayed alert, but they didn't degrade the captives or beat them for moving too slowly. They maintained authority without savagery. When one aging captive tripped on the frozen walkway, a sentry reached down and lifted him by the arm. No strike, no contempt. Just a brief acknowledgement before continuing. It was profoundly puzzling. That evening, as the captives gathered in their quarters, discussions ran hushed and troubled. "Can you trust them?" one man questioned, staring at the ceiling supports. "They speak of protocols, as though this is some mutual agreement. Don't they despise us?" Another responded, "They must be pretending, to ensnare us, to extract information." And yet, when quiet descended, the aroma from the kitchens drifted over once more. It was dense, abundant, greasy, not the acidic, thin soups they recognized from the islands, but something complete, something satisfying. Their stomachs rumbled involuntarily, exposing them. The Americans, it appeared, didn't regard food as leverage. For them, it was standard procedure. A Tuesday supper, a Thursday midday meal. Nothing extraordinary. But for the Japanese captives who had trudged half-dead through wilderness and coastline, who had concealed themselves in caverns gnawing on roots, who had yielded with empty bellies and skin pulled taut that aroma was nearly intolerable. Some buried their faces in their covers to shut it out. Others whispered that tomorrow, possibly, the deception would emerge. Perhaps the nourishment was lure, perhaps the compassion would evaporate as swiftly as it had surfaced. Yet when the next day arrived, the queues formed once more, and the serving dishes were loaded again, and the routine persisted, consistent and unwavering. The protocols were authentic, the inspections were authentic, the formalities were authentic, and the most peculiar truth of all was gradually pressing itself against their assumptions. America, even during war, maintained faith in structure. But the structure of protocols was insignificant compared to what awaited in the dining facility itself, where hunger and remembrance would clash with a burger and a glass bottle they'd never encountered before. The queue advanced slowly, boots dragging against the dining hall surface. Vapor rose from serving dishes behind the station, carrying a fragrance so unfamiliar to Japanese senses that most of the men couldn't identify it. It was substantial, dense, smoky, meat, certainly, but unlike the preserved fish or tiny portions they once consumed at home. This was thicker, more robust, something approaching indulgence. The captives gripped their metal trays like protective barriers, anticipating the degradation to arrive. Perhaps remnants would be tossed at them. Perhaps spoiled nourishment would be scooped out with mockery. That was their expectation. Hunger stretched every moment longer, but apprehension prevented them from appearing too anxious. Then the initial serviceman stepped to the counter. An American cook, sleeves pushed to his elbows, placed a heated patty onto the bread with a flat tool, then added fried potatoes alongside. Finally, he grabbed a glass bottle dripping with moisture, removed the cap, and slid it onto the tray. The crimson lettering on the label was strange, almost ornamental. The Japanese serviceman stared at the tray as if it were trickery. His hand quivered. "Keep moving," the cook said without emotion. The captive shuffled onward, still staring. Behind him, others leaned to glimpse what had been distributed. Murmurs travelled down the queue. "Meat! They're distributing meat to us." When additional trays started filling, disbelief intensified. The bread was yielding to the touch, the potatoes fried to a golden colour, and the bottle Coca-Cola, a century clarified, curtly bubbled as though animated. In the hall's corner, the captives occupied long wooden tables. They examined the food warily, almost distrustfully, like men who had wandered into prohibited space. A few brought the bottle to their mouths. The sweetness detonated first, then the sting of carbonation in their windpipes. Some choked, coughing from the jolt. Others expanded their eyes in amazement. One man released laughter, an unrestrained explosion that shocked his tablemates. Another concealed his mouth and dropped his head, shoulders trembling, torn between laughter and weeping. A lean serviceman, ribs apparent even beneath his new uniform, raised his burger with both palms as though it might crumble. He inhaled its scent, then bit down. Grease trickled down his jaw. He froze, chewing gradually as if each bite might disappear if he shifted too abruptly. Then he dropped his face, concealing the tears that formed. A bunkmate nudged him. "Are you well?" The man swallowed with difficulty. "I had lost the memory of fat's flavour." At another table, two captives discussed quietly. "They wish to render us feeble," one contended. "They fatten us so we abandon our mission." Or, his companion said gradually, "They simply consume like this daily." That notion was more difficult to accept than the food itself. The dining facility filled with subdued sounds, chewing, muffled laughter, an occasional sob swiftly concealed. For a collection of men who had endured the starvation of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and the home island's failing supply networks, the meal was beyond sustenance. It was an assault on their beliefs. One captive later whispered to his bunkmate that the sweetness of the Coca-Cola seemed like a nightmare inverted too mild to exist in warfare. The Americans distributing the food observed nothing exceptional. To them, it was routine. They consumed the identical burger and fries, washed it down with the same bottle of Coke, and thought nothing of it. For the sentries and cooks, feeding captives was procedure. But for the captives themselves, it was as if they had stepped into an alternate reality. What disturbed them most wasn't the plenty, but the ordinariness of it all. The Americans weren't commemorating, they weren't taunting. This wasn't a banquet designed to impress, it was simply Tuesday supper. That contrast struck harder than any insult could have. Here were men who had battled fiercely, who had been informed that America was starving, decadent, on collapse's edge. Yet in captivity, they were eating superior food to what they'd had as free servicemen of the empire. The shame was acute, but the relief was more acute still. By the time trays were cleared and bottles stood empty on the tables, the captives leaned back in silence. Some folded their palms as if in worship. Others gazed vacantly at the wall, attempting to process what had just occurred. The dining hall sentries signalled for order, directing the men back to their quarters. The captives filed out, still stunned, still murmuring among themselves about what they had tasted. That evening, resting on beds beneath wool covers, the memory of the burger and Coca-Cola remained with them, not merely as nourishment but as evidence. Evidence that their adversary inhabited a different realm. One where sweetness could be squandered on captives, one where meat was so abundant it could be formed into patties and distributed without consideration. But nourishment was only the beginning. Once the patterns of daily existence inside Camp McCoy took hold, the captives would confront a new challenge, living with structure, monotony, and instances of humanity that tested everything they believed they understood. The surprise of that initial meal persisted, but it didn't eliminate the reality of imprisonment. Each morning, the prisoners of war at Camp McCoy awakened to the sound of attendance calls, boots compressing in the frost. Rifles aimed toward them from the towers overhead. The barbed wire was constantly present, slicing across the skyline, reminding them that this existence, regardless of how different from their expectations, remained a prison. Inside the wire, routine governed everything. After breakfast, captives were separated into groups. Some were tasked with clearing snow from pathways, others with chopping wood. Still others with assisting on adjacent farms under sentry supervision. The labor was consistent, not harsh. It surprised most of the men that they weren't being exploited to exhaustion. Instead, they received small payments in camp vouchers, which could be traded for merchandise at the camp store. Toiletries, writing materials, even confections or tobacco. One afternoon, a Japanese serviceman held up a chocolate bar he'd acquired with his vouchers. His hands shook as he unwrapped it. "In Japan," he murmured to a fellow captive, "this is medicinal. Here they distribute it to servicemen like it's trivial." His companion shook his head in astonishment. The store itself was another revelation. Captives observed American servicemen entering and exiting, conversing casually, purchasing Coke or chewing gum, bantering with the attendant. The informality of it was almost insufferable. War was raging in Europe and the Pacific, yet here in Wisconsin, Americans appeared to live as though abundance would never diminish. Still, the daily framework of camp existence began to weigh down in a different manner. There was no combat, no advancing, no perishing comrades to inter. Instead, there was tedium, wake, work, eat, sleep. The mind, once absorbed by survival, now had capacity to drift, and with drifting came yearning. Letters became vital connections. The camp permitted each captive to compose 2 letters and 4 postcards monthly, heavily censored yet still valuable. Men hunched over tables, scratching out words with pencils, attempting to capture their homes in ink. "I am alive" was frequently all they could accomplish. Some received responses, thin envelopes with kanji inscribed in recognizable handwriting. Others received nothing. For those men, silence grew more oppressive with each passing week. English lessons were provided in the evenings. A few curious captives participated, repeating words slowly after the American instructor. Bread, table, window. Others scoffed, insisting there was no purpose in learning the adversary's language. But even the doubters listened from their beds, ears catching the peculiar rhythm of the words. There were instances of unexpected interaction. A sentry at the work location once inquired of a captive, "Do you miss rice?" The translator conveyed the question. The captive laughed bitterly and responded in Japanese, "Rice is a distant memory." When the reply was translated, the sentry grew silent, perhaps grasping the weight behind the words. Not all interactions were so delicate. Suspicion remained. Some sentries treated the captives with coldness, never speaking beyond instructions, and within the quarters, disputes erupted among the captives themselves. Some clung fiercely to the notion that Japan would prevail, that these months of imprisonment would conclude in triumph. Others, worn down by what they'd witnessed, muttered that defeat was unavoidable. One night, two men argued so intensely that the sentry had to step in. "You disgrace our homeland when you mention defeat," one captive shouted. "And you disgrace logic by rejecting what is in front of your eyes." The other retorted. The sentry silenced them, but the strain persisted. Even in the heart of America, the war existed inside their thoughts. Yet existence in the camp also generated small human patterns. Captives carved wooden figures during leisure hours, played makeshift games, or simply gathered telling stories of home. The scent of the dining facility never stopped haunting them, but at least it was dependable. 3 meals daily, regardless. That fact alone distinguished this imprisonment from the jungle positions and deteriorating islands they'd departed from. In the quarters at night, silence frequently descended quickly after lights dimmed, but occasionally someone whispered into the darkness, "What do you think your family consumes tonight?" The answers never emerged, just sighs and the rustling of covers. Daily existence in Camp McCoy wasn't freedom, it wasn't brutality either. It was something between a limbo where survival was guaranteed, but meaning felt elusive. But the longer they existed within the wire, the more they began to perceive something peculiar. Behind the rigid schedules and guarded fences, instances of connection began to emerge between captor and captive. Instances that couldn't be rationalized away by regulations or routine. For weeks, the camp operated like precision machinery. Sentries issued commands. Captives complied. Meals arrived on schedule. The rhythm was foreseeable, even tedious. But between those routines, small openings appeared where humanity slipped through instances that neither party could have envisioned when the war started. It frequently began with the most basic thing: language. Few of the Japanese captives spoke English beyond a handful of terms, and most Americans in the camp possessed no Japanese whatsoever. Commands were issued through translators or hand signals, yet necessity compelled both parties to improvise. A sentry might indicate a shovel and bark, work. A captive, catching the sound, would repeat it awkwardly beneath his breath, waku. Soon others followed, chuckling quietly at their own clumsy efforts. One evening, during an English lesson, an American instructor inscribed the word family on the chalkboard. He requested a volunteer to pronounce it aloud. A captive stood, hesitated, then said. The class erupted into laughter, not malicious but authentic, and even the instructor grinned. The captive smiled too, his expression softening for the first time in weeks. In that instant, the designation of adversary yielded to something more ordinary. Men attempting to span a divide. Nourishment, once again, became a sort of shared territory. On an uncommon occasion, sentries distributed cigarettes or chewing gum with captives during work assignments. The gum baffled them. One man chewed briefly, then ingested it completely. The Americans burst into laughter, shaking their heads, attempting to clarify. Soon, gum became a modest symbol of trade. A sentry offering. A captive accepting with a rigid bow. There were also confrontations. On a farm beyond the camp, where a group of POWs labored clearing land, an American farmer observed them closely. His son had perished in the Pacific, and resentment simmered in his gaze. When one captive bent to retrieve a dropped implement, the farmer expelled saliva on the ground near his feet. The sentry escorting the work detail noticed, said nothing, but moved closer. The strain hung in the frigid air, unspoken yet intense. The farmer turned away, muttering, "Should have abandoned them to starve." That incident spread rapidly among the captives when they returned to camp. "Not all Americans follow their protocols," one said grimly. His bunkmate replied, Of course not. They are men like us. Some will despise, some will not. Inside the wire, friendships occasionally developed where nobody anticipated them. A young sentry named Miller, barely 20 with a gentle accent from Illinois, often lingered near the quarters after duty. He carried photographs of his family, displaying them to captives who assembled near the fence. They didn't comprehend his words, but they understood the faces. A mother, a father, 2 small sisters. In return, captives traced shapes in the earth, sketching their own homes, their villages, their wives waiting oceans distant. It wasn't dialogue in words, but dialogue in pictures. One evening, Miller managed to say slowly, "Mother, father, sisters." He indicated the photos. A captive nodded, touched his chest, and said in Japanese, "Haha, chichi, imoto." The exchange lasted only moments before another sentry ordered Miller away. But the seed was planted. They had communicated across the chasm, if only for a brief moment. Still, culture ran deep, and suspicion ran deeper. Among the Japanese, loyalty to the emperor wasn't erased by burgers or Coca-Cola. Some men whispered warnings against softening. They accused fellow captives who attended English lessons of betraying their honor. In the dim light of the quarters, arguments ignited. Was survival worth adaptation? Or did every borrowed word, every moment of laughter with a sentry, chip away at who they were? One captive wrote secretly in his diary, "We were informed Americans were beasts, yet they share their gum. They heal our injuries." Which is the falsehood? Which is the reality? The contradictions gnawed at them. For some, the kindness of sentries felt like humiliation, a reminder that they existed better as captives than their families did back home. For others, those same instances hinted at something uncomfortable but undeniable. The adversary wasn't faceless. One snowy evening, as lights extinguished across the camp, a captive whispered to his bunkmate, "If we survive this war, what will we tell our children? That our adversary fed us? That he provided blankets? That he smiled at us?" The bunkmate remained silent for an extended time before answering softly, "We will tell them the reality, even if it brings shame." But the reality was complicated, and as the war dragged toward its bitter conclusion, the contradictions inside Camp McCoy only grew more oppressive, until the captives were compelled to confront the question of what loyalty truly meant. By the winter of 1945, the rhythms of Camp McCoy had settled into something the captives couldn't have envisioned when they first descended from the train. Hunger no longer etched their faces as severely. Work, though tiring, didn't shatter their bodies. They composed letters home, some even daring to request the sentries how to spell English terms. On the surface, existence looked manageable, yet beneath that surface ran a profound conflict, one that grew more acute as weeks transformed to months. How could they reconcile this treatment with the hatred and loyalty they still harbored in their hearts? Every night, debates flared in the quarters. Some argued fiercely that this was all manipulation, that America only pretended to treat captives well to weaken them, to steal their spirit before repatriation. One man stood one night, voice harsh. "Don't be deceived. Our emperor demands strength, not comfort. Every burger you consume is a betrayal." Others, weary of suffering, pushed back. "We are alive," one countered, "and if survival is betrayal, then what did dying hungry on Saipan accomplish?" Silence followed those words. Silence and shame. Letters from home made the contradictions sting even more sharply. When a captive received word that his family in Osaka survived on boiled weeds and fragments of barley, he held the paper in trembling hands while the scent of roast beef drifted from the dining facility. The chasm between his existence as a captive and theirs as civilians under bombing raids became unbearable. "I eat like a serviceman," he confessed quietly, "while my children starve." It wasn't only food. Warmth itself became symbolic. In quarters heated by stoves, with wool covers and sturdy boots, the men remembered families shivering back in wooden houses with glass shattered from air raids. Captivity offered them safety, yet it deepened their guilt. Some captives clung harder to propaganda, repeating it like prayers. America was decadent, hollow, ready to collapse, but the evidence surrounding them mocked those words. In the camp, Coca-Cola bottles arrived by the crate. Cigarettes were available not just for servicemen but for captives. Work crews saw American farmers with tractors, barns full of livestock, fields that seemed endless. Abundance here wasn't fantasy. It was normal. One sentry, overhearing a captive remark on the overflowing fields, said simply, "This is only Wisconsin. You should see Illinois." The captive lowered his eyes, mortified by the envy burning in him. The contradictions broke some men quietly. One evening, a captive whispered through tears, "I believed Japan was the center of the world, but now I see, perhaps we are only one small island." His bunkmate scolded him, warned him never to speak such treason aloud. But the thought had been voiced, and thoughts cannot be retracted. Religion added another layer. Some captives assembled in hushed circles, reciting prayers to ancestors, clinging to tradition. Others observed American chaplains lead services for their own men, and curiosity sparked. A few even attended, if only to sit in the chapel's warmth. They didn't comprehend the hymns, but they recognized the act of faith. Different gods, different rituals, but the same human hunger for hope. Perhaps the most painful contradiction came during Red Cross inspections. The officials inquired if the captives were treated well. Most answered yes, because it was true, but afterward, in the quarters, shame swept over them. We admit our adversary treats us fairly while our own nation cannot feed us. What does that make us? Nobody had an answer. One snowy afternoon, a work crew was clearing a pathway outside the camp when a group of American children approached. They were curious, bold, their cheeks reddened from the cold. One girl held out a candy bar, offering it through the wire to a Japanese captive. He froze. He had faced bombs, bullets, starvation. But the innocent gesture of a child terrified him more than any weapon. Slowly, he took the candy, bowed low, and said in halting English, "Thank you." The girl smiled, skipped back to her friends. That night, the man confessed to his bunkmates that he felt more broken by that small kindness than by all the battles he had endured. "A child of the adversary," he whispered, "gave me food with a smile. How can I hate her?" Such instances left scars of confusion. They didn't erase loyalty to the emperor, nor did they end the war inside their hearts. But they made the line between friend and foe blurrier than propaganda ever admitted. As 1945 pressed on, the men knew the war outside was reaching its climax. Rumors of bombings in Tokyo, of losses in the Philippines, trickled into camp. Each new report widened the contradiction. Inside the barbed wire, they lived with steady meals, shelter, even glimpses of humanity. Outside, their nation burned. But captivity, no matter how humane, couldn't last forever. The question looming ahead was simple and terrifying. What would happen when the gates finally opened and they returned to a homeland scarred by fire and hunger? By the summer of 1945, the world outside Camp McCoy had shifted beyond recognition. Whispers transformed to headlines, carried in American newspapers that the captives occasionally glimpsed through sentries or Red Cross representatives. The Allies were advancing in Europe. Cities in Japan were burning under waves of bombers. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck, rumors raced through the camp faster than sentries could silence them. Most captives didn't fully comprehend what an atomic bomb was, but the horror of it bled through every word. Then came the truth they couldn't ignore. Japan had surrendered. The announcement fell over the camp like a weight no one could lift. Some captives stared blankly at the ground. Others wept in silence, their shoulders shaking under thin covers. For years, they had carried the belief that their nation could not fall, that death was preferable to defeat. Now defeat had arrived while they were behind barbed wire, unable to lift a weapon, unable to choose their fate. Days passed in a strange quiet. The sentries didn't gloat. They simply carried on with the routines. Meals, roll calls, inspections. For many captives, that steadiness was unbearable. "They treat us the same," one man whispered bitterly, "whether we are warriors or defeated. Do they not see our shame?" but the camp was already preparing for repatriation. The Red Cross began organizing lists, transportation routes, schedules. Captives were given clean uniforms, medical checkups, and briefings about the journey ahead. They would be shipped back across the Pacific, not as servicemen of a victorious empire, but as survivors of a war their nation had lost. The departure was not triumphant. On the morning of the transfer, the captives filed out of their quarters, carrying small bundles of belongings. Some clutched wooden carvings made during idle hours. Others carried carefully folded letters from home, stained with tears and sweat. As they passed through the gates, many glanced back one last time at the camp that had held them. It wasn't fondness that moved them, but confusion. The place where they had expected brutality had instead given them burgers, Coca-Cola, blankets, and even glimpses of kindness. The journey home was long and heavy. On the ship, men huddled together, wondering what awaited them in Japan. Cities were gone, families scattered, hunger worse than when they left. They worried about being branded cowards, despised for having lived as captives. The guilt was acute, but so was another memory they couldn't forget: the taste of that first meal in Camp McCoy. One man, scribbling in a worn notebook, wrote, "I thought my adversary would break me with violence. Instead, he broke me with food. I cannot erase the taste of bread, meat, and sweetness. It will follow me home like a shadow." When the captives finally stepped onto Japanese soil, reality struck hard. Bombed ruins stretched where cities once stood. Families met them with tears, relief, and sometimes bitterness. Some wives and children had survived on grass and tree bark. Others had not survived at all. The returning captives faced accusations of weakness, of disgrace, but in their silence, they carried stories no one at home wanted to hear: stories of burgers and Coca-Cola, of Americans who treated them by rules instead of rage. In the years that followed, a few spoke cautiously about their time in America. They admitted that it had forced them to see the adversary not as monsters, but as men. Others never spoke at all, burying the memories under layers of duty and shame. Yet, even in silence, the contradictions lived on. The legacy of Camp McCoy and other camps like it is not found in battles or victories, but in those quiet, disorienting instances when food, kindness, and structure collided with fear and loyalty. For the captives, imprisonment revealed something uncomfortable but undeniable. Humanity could exist even in the middle of war, and perhaps that is the final lesson. Wars end, nations rise and fall, but the small choices, a sentry sharing a photograph, a child offering candy, a cook sliding a burger across a counter, can leave marks that outlast the noise of cannons. For those Japanese captives, the taste of Coca-Cola and the grease of a burger became symbols of contradiction, but also of survival. They reminded the men that even adversaries can show mercy, and that sometimes mercy cuts deeper than hatred. As one captive told his son years later, "I learned in America that kindness is harder to carry than brutality. Brutality you can fight, kindness you remember. War can strip men of everything, but it cannot erase the power of small acts of humanity, and that is the story worth remembering." If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more true accounts of World War II history. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us of the choices humans make in the darkest hours, choices that reveal who we really are.